Edward Hale was not a soldier. He was a poet, more ink than iron, more thought than thunder. His world was verses and valleys, a quiet England dotted with birch trees and the soft hush of cathedral bells. He lived in a stone cottage in Sussex, with a typewriter, a mother who hummed hymns as she knitted, and books stacked high enough to keep the wind out. The war came not with cannon, but with conversation, slipping into parlors and train stations like smoke. A quick war, they said, home by Christmas. Edward, 21 and fragile of frame, enlisted not for duty but for doubt. What right had he to write of truth, he thought, if he had never stood beside it in mud and fire? He packed a notebook before a rifle, kissed his mother's cheek, and joined the 9th Royal Sussex Regiment. His soft hands would learn the weight of bayonets. His eyes would unlearn beauty, but in that summer's light, before France or Flanders, he still believed. He would return with poems in his pack and glory on his sleeve. They reached the front in rain. Nothing in his village, nor in verse, prepared Edward for the howling gap between one life and another. At Loos, the earth itself was torn and alive, coughing bodies and smoke from its wounds. Edward's friend James, who once recited Keats beneath the barracks moon, screamed for his mother as shrapnel chewed through his stomach. He died with his hand in Edward's, mouthing a prayer that never finished. Edward did not write that night. He sat beside the corpse until morning, his uniform soaked with blood and rain. The boy who once wrote lines about the wind through willows stared into the ash-colored dawn with no words at all. Something had cracked. Not shattered, cracked. A fine fracture behind the eyes, a hush where once a tide of thought moved freely. His pen felt too light, too foolish, and for the first time, Edward began to fear silence more than sound. The trench was not a line, it was a womb, a grave, a theatre, a place where rats grew bold and boots never dried. Edward's hands were calloused now, his poetry locked inside letters he never sent. The men called him Oxford, not kindly, but with a kind of tired affection. He carried their words more than his own stories of wives, children, ail, and aching. He wrote letters for those who couldn't, poems for those who wanted graves marked with more than names. Shellfire became rhythm, the scream of mortar, the whistle of gas. One night he watched a boy drown in mud, too thick to pull free. Another night he helped a chaplain bury 14 men with no names. He dreamed often of James, mouth still open, prayer still unfinished. But when he awoke, he remembered less of the dream and more of the absence it left behind. And each day Edward wrote one line less in his book, until finally the pages stayed empty. It came to a head on a morning of fog, when Edward found himself holding his rifle not at the Germans, but at his own boots. A moment, that's all. A second of stillness, of wondering if one pull could silence the war inside more than the war. Outside, he lowered the gun and wept where no one saw. That afternoon, a German soldier stumbled through the wire, arms raised, bleeding badly. The men shouted, ready to fire, but Edward saw a boy, the same age as James, as him. He rushed forward, waving his arms, screaming, "Don't shoot," and dragged the enemy to safety. The men spat at him later, but the officer nodded once, slowly. "Your hands are too soft for killing," he said, "but strong enough for saving." Remember that night Edward wrote a poem, not in beauty, not in peace, but in defiance of despair. A verse carved out of blood and smoke. For the first time in months, he felt human. Edward was changed, not mad, not yet, but hollow in a way the others weren't. He couldn't laugh at the crude jokes anymore, couldn't eat meat without seeing it rot in mud. He was caught writing a letter to the German boy he said, to be sent, just thoughts, apologies, and verses. When the letter was found, some called him a traitor. Rumors spread. His own comrades whispered coward. Kraut lover, half-cracked. Command transferred him to a field hospital. To recover, the doctors called it neurasthenia, shell shock, a fashionable term, like a bandage placed gently on a severed limb. He would sit in whitewashed rooms, surrounded by others who twitched and wept and stared for hours at walls. Men broken not by bullets, but by memory. He began drawing instead. Of writing, sketches of hands, of eyes, of silence. A doctor said, "You should go home." But Edward wasn't sure where that was anymore. They sent him back, of course. Back to Ypres, to Passiendel, to the fields where names were drowned in rain. He wasn't healed, just recycled. A poet with a rifle. The mud deeper now, the sky angrier, the ground more grave than earth. One morning, a young replacement froze under fire. Edward remembered James, remembered the German boy. He stood, dragged the lad behind cover, and in doing so, took a bullet through the lung. It didn't kill him, not right away. As they carried him back, Edward laughed. He didn't know why. Maybe it was madness. Maybe it was the absurdity of surviving for so long, only to fall just before the finish. As he faded, he whispered a line of poetry he'd kept hidden for months. What is a man, if not a word that walks and bleeds? He died 1 hour before the Armistice. The stretcher bearers did not know his name. The war was ending. Bells would ring in England. Champagne would spill in Paris. Mothers would weep in every language. Edward Hale's notebook was found in his coat half full, the last page torn. It was mailed home with his effects. His mother opened it weeks later and found a single line on the inside cover. "Forgive me for not coming back whole." She placed it on his writing desk, beside the pen he left behind. And sometimes, when the wind passed through the windows, just right, it turned the pages gently, as if Edward was still writing somewhere beyond the war.